You would think that if a family member was turned into a monstrous insect and then as a family member you had to take care of that person, you would think that this would lead to a drastic and significant change in lifestyle and the way you viewed the world and basically just the way you lived your life and the way you viewed life in general. But in part two of Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, we find out that a drastic change in lifestyle for the family of Gregor, who was turned into a monstrous insect, is exactly what doesn't happen. In fact, the opposite happens. The family settles into a routine. All three of Gregor's family members, the mom, the dad, and the sister, are horrified by Gregor's appearance, and really none of them can stand to look at him for long or to be in the same room as him for long. So this routine sets in where Gregor is shut up in his bedroom and his sister Greta is taking over as the primary caregiver. She begins to take care of him, to at least show him the smallest amount of compassion. She's really the only one to do that, other than the mom to some extent. But Greta brings him food. She finds that he likes old cheese and old vegetables, perfect bug food. Now, she doesn't want to look too much or stay too long, but at least she does help, and she does become the primary caretaker for Gregor. And so this boring routine settles into place. Gregor gets fed by his sister. Occasionally, he will press himself up against the wall of his bedroom in order to hear what's going on in the family. He does have some moments of enjoyment where he crawls on the walls, which he seems to enjoy, and he likes to hang from the ceiling as opposed to being shut up in the corner of the room or stuck on the bed. When Gregor does listen in on his family, the talk is of money and how the family is going to account for Gregor's lost income. Gregor becomes anxious and stressed by this. In particular, he's worried that his sister may have to pick up a job in order to make more money for the family, and that in doing that, she might become what he became. The day-to-day routine of working in the modern world might take away some of that innocence and spirituality that Gregor prizes in her. But life goes on, and eventually the sister does take a job in order to try to make more money for the family. But I think the point here is that there is this way where the absurdity of the situation is being contrasted with people's desires to just continue living their life, and the drive and motivation for things to be convenient is often at odds with what has happened to Gregor and maybe what Gregor is owed. Now, just as an aside here, I read the version of the Metamorphosis translated by Susan Bernofsky, and there's some interesting notes about translation in general, and in particular, the way that this story is translated, which I'm going to get to later. But this version of the story comes with an introduction by filmmaker David Cronenberg. And in that intro, Cronenberg says, quote, "Kafka's story is, of course, not science fiction. It does not provoke discussion regarding technology and the hubris of scientific investigation or the use of scientific research for military purposes. Without sci-fi trappings of any kind, the Metamorphosis forces us to think in terms of analogy, of reflexive interpretation, though it is revealed that none of the characters in the story, including Gregor, ever does think that way. There is no meditation on a family secret or sin that might have induced such a monstrous reprisal by God or the fates. No search for meaning, even on the most basic existential plane. The bizarre event is dealt with in a perfunctory, petty, materialistic way, and it arouses the narrowest range of emotional response imaginable, almost immediately assuming the tone of an unfortunate natural family occurrence with which one must reluctantly contend. End quote. I think Cronenberg is right here. I also think it's interesting and maybe even ironic that the very thing that potentially got Gregor into this situation, the boring, ordinary, mundane way that he was living his life, is exactly how his family responds to his situation. Almost as if in life you can't escape that ordinary, boring aspect to it. At any rate, here in part 2, we get a better sense of Gregor's family. So his sister Greta is the only person in the family that is named, interestingly. And it seems like Gregor is the closest to her. She's younger than him, and it seems like they have a decent relationship. Greta loves to play music. She plays the violin, and Gregor really enjoys this about her, and he loves the music that she plays. He even intended in the future to send her to a conservatory where maybe she could hone her musical talent and learn the craft a little bit better. Of course, this long-term plan is totally destroyed by what happens to Gregor here, but this idea of Gregor's interest in Greta's musical abilities is going to play a big role moving forward in the story, especially in part 3. So at least initially, it kind of makes sense why the sister Greta is the one to assume the primary caretaker role with Gregor. Next is Gregor's mom, who does appear to show some signs of compassion and tolerance towards Gregor, but even she can't stay in the same room as him, and eventually she's going to faint in the presence of him and is generally horrified by him. And then there's the dad, who Gregor seems to be afraid of, which I think could indicate potentially some past trauma inflicted on him by the dad. And the dad is also seemingly the primary driver of keeping Gregor locked up in his room and preventing people from being able to see him. The dad hasn't worked in a long time, and it's actually his debts and his poor financial situation that Gregor was trying to alleviate by working so hard. And of course, all of this is going to get turned on its head very soon when we start getting more information about the family. It does seem that in general, the family was very quick to write off Gregor. They seem to very quickly accept that this is the new Gregor. This monstrous insect is what we're dealing with now. And other than maybe hoping that he's going to turn back to the way he was, the family doesn't seem to spend a lot of time remembering who he was and factoring in that past identity and the fact that this is their son into their current assessment of him. All they see is this monstrous insect that has to be dealt with and is causing them a massive inconvenience. This brings us to another idea and another theme of the story, which is the idea of how change and metamorphosis affect memory and vice versa. So at what point should Gregor simply accept that he is now something new? Or should he cling to his former self for as long as possible? Is he the person who he was before he was transformed into a bug? Or is he now just a bug? Could there be some sort of balance to this situation? And can you ever go back to being the person that you once were? Can you turn back the clocks and forget that the present is happening or that the future will happen? What if that past is holding you back? Can you let it go? And should you let it go, especially if letting it go might make the new you a little bit more comfortable? David Cronenberg plays with this idea a little bit in his introduction to the story, saying, quote, "The Samsa beetle's short life, fantastical though it is played out on the level of the resolutely mundane and the functional, and fails to provoke in the story's characters any hint of philosophy, meditation, or profound reflection. How similar would the story be then if, on that fateful morning, the Samsa family found in the room of their son not a young, vibrant, traveling salesman who was supporting them by his unselfish and endless labor, but a shuffling, half-blind, barely ambulatory 89-year-old man using insect-like canes, a man who mumbles incoherently and who has soiled his trousers and out of the shadowland of his dementia projects anger and induces guilt. If, when Gregor Samsa woke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed right there in his bed into a demented, disabled, demanding old man. His family is horrified, but somehow recognize him as their own Gregor, albeit transformed. Eventually, though, as in the Beetle variant of the story, they decide that he is no longer their Gregor and that it would be a blessing for him to disappear. End quote. This idea of sudden versus gradual change is something that's interesting to think about. We all go through gradual change. Cronenberg there discussing how all of us one day will grow old and have a very similar situation to what Gregor's going through in the Metamorphosis, but because that change doesn't happen suddenly and directly and overnight, it's a little bit easier to deal with. Whereas perhaps unfairly, when that change is drastic and immediate, the resulting care and compassion that is applied to it might not be the same. Anyways, back to the story. One of the big conflicts in part 2 of the Metamorphosis is the mundane way that Gregor's sister and his mom sort of deal with him. And one of the big issues is the room that Gregor is in. The sister seems to notice that Gregor likes to be up on the walls and he likes to hang from the ceiling. So perhaps out of the kindness of her heart, she decides maybe we should get rid of all the furniture in the room. Gregor, of course, can't give any input on that idea because he can't talk. But these ideas of clinging on to the past versus letting go become very real, and the furniture of the room becomes a symbol of this conflict that's happening within Gregor and also within Gregor's family. On the one hand, Gregor would love it if the furniture was moved out of the room. It would give him plenty of space to move around and maybe be a little bit happier. But on the other hand, that furniture is one of the only things left that connects him to who he was. And if all of those memories and all of those items that bring back those memories are removed, then what is he? Who is he? Kafka writes, quote, Gregor realized that the absence of all direct human address, combined with the monotony of life in his family's midst, must have muddled his understanding over the course of these 2 months, for he could not otherwise explain to himself how he seriously could have wished to have his room emptied out. Did he really want to have this warm room, comfortably furnished with family heirlooms, transformed into a cave or a den, in which, to be sure, he would be able to crawl about unhindered in every direction, but at the price of simultaneously, swiftly, and completely forgetting his human past? He was already on the verge of forgetting, and only his mother's voice, which he had gone so long now without hearing, had shaken him awake. Nothing should be removed. Everything must remain. He was unwilling to forego the good influence this furniture had on his condition. And if the furniture got in the way of his practicing this mindless crawling about, this was by no means to his detriment. In fact, it was a great advantage. Unfortunately, his sister was of a different opinion. She had developed the habit, not entirely without cause to be sure, of presenting herself as the holder of particular expertise when discussing Gregor with her parents, and so now too her mother's counsel was reason enough for her to insist on the removal not only of the wardrobe and the desk, as she had originally been intending, but of every last bit of the room's furnishings, with the exception of the indispensable settee. End quote. Kafka twisting the knife here as he has Gregor finally decide that he wants to keep the furniture in order to maintain a connection with his human past, only to have his sister who is trying to help him remove all the furniture. Absolutely brutal, and it's only going to increase the isolation and the loneliness and increasingly the diminished connection to his old sense of self. Gregor also realizes that if they get rid of the furniture in the room, no one will ever want to come in there. First of all, because nobody wants to hang out with him. He's a monster. But also because if there's nothing else in the room, they would never have any reason to go in there. He says, quote, "For a room in which Gregor held sole dominion over empty walls was a place where no one other than Greta would ever dare to set foot." End quote. Ultimately, the sister and the mom decide that they are going to move the furniture away, and Gregor can't take it. He's watching them take away everything that was near and dear to him, and in particular, that old picture frame that he created the frame for, and it has the picture of the woman inside. Gregor can't bear to have that moved out of the room, so he climbs out of his hole and he clings on to the picture. This is upsetting to the mom and the sister because they're expecting him to remain behind a sheet covered in the corner where nobody can see him. And he comes out, he tries to save the picture. Predictably, everybody freaks out. His mom falls down, fainting. His sister's yelling at him. He's trying to help and trying to explain the situation, but again, he can't communicate, and without language to facilitate him, almost everything he does is going to be misinterpreted. The father eventually comes home and comes in, sees Gregor kind of loose in the house, and immediately the father is trying to shoo him back into the room. Eventually he starts pelting him with apples, and there's some religious imagery here. The apple perhaps representing sin or human nature or the Garden of Eden. But at any rate, one of them gets embedded in Gregor. It hurts a lot. The father's basically on the verge of stamping Gregor's life out, killing him. Ultimately, the mom comes back from fainting and pleads for Gregor's life, and he gets shut up in his room once again to end part 2. As Gregor physically, spiritually, and mentally increasingly becomes untethered from his past memories and his past self, his sense of isolation and loneliness and unease is continuing to rise. Just like at the end of part 1, he's now shut up again inside his room in part 2, this time with even less hope than before. And the stage is set for the conclusion of Gregor's story in part 3 of the Metamorphosis, coming next episode.